to segment 7.6. I'm again in the textbook, and I recognize that I already discussed this in the last lecture, but I do want to bring your attention to kind of some of the end goals. So in the last lecture, we were looking at some of the steps you can take and the alternative routes that you can actually take, whether that's a litigation route or a brokerage route or licensing route. But on page 309, you can see through 309 all the way through page 314. So 309 through 314, this is often what would be included in that portfolio type offering. And this would often be what you would see by a patent broker, but a similar type methodology would often be found even with, for example, licensing type opportunities as well. A licensing would often include a cover letter that indicates, hey, then these are the assets within the portfolio. There's potential applicability to your company. And please look at exhibits 1, 2, and 3 that include Rule 11 charts that actually show the potential applicability between these patents and inventions and your particular products or company. So, but in short, I just want to reference that again because when we get to these monetization avenues, it is all premised on having very clear showing of infringement, which is shown by Rule 11 charts. So the more clear you can show that infringement and the more evidence you have to actually support your position in the Rule 11 charts, the better you are to actually have options if you want to explore, for example, litigation, brokerage, or licensing. In this particular example, I'm going to do exactly that, and that is give you an example, another example. But previously we were looking at the table example with the 4 types of legs. Now I'm going to give you another example. So the first one here is, this is from an actual patent, and you can see, first off, let's go to the next slide. This is the patented invention. So you can see that it's there's a bird feeder. This is some type of a bird feeder. There's some canopy, there's a covering. There's also some stand for the birds to stand on. And that's about it. So let's come back to the claim. And you may be saying, well, bird feeders have kind of existed for a long year. And I would say, yes, they have existed for a long time, not a long year, for a long time. But how is this distinguished? So we have at least one canopy portion, so that would be some shelter at the top. Well, first off, it's a bird feeder comprising, so it's a bird feeder, has a canopy portion, a food reservoir coupled to the canopy portion. So again, we have broken down our invention into parts, and now we're simply reading each of these parts. So we have a canopy, we have a food reservoir, we have a perch coupled to the food reservoir, so we have a perch on the bottom. It doesn't necessarily tell us where it is that the canopy and the perch have to be in relation to. So you may have a canopy up here and a perch down here, or you may have a perch halfway up, or you might have a few perches or a few canopies. So we don't necessarily have any specification as far as how that must actually be. And we have a rechargeable electrical power source. Okay, so yes, bird feeders have existed for a long time, but in particular, bird feeders with a renewable or rechargeable electrical power source, yeah, that may not have existed for a lot of time. And then we have at least a lighting element. So in addition to having a power source, we have a light element, and it is attached to this power source, and a solar energy system is attached to the power source that collects the solar energy, charges the power source so that it can produce light. So in other words, we have some rechargeable solar system. We have a solar system that collects the energy that then charges up a battery or some rechargeable electrical power source that in turn provides the power for at least one lighting element. And then the last one is wherein at least one lighting element is a cold cathode ray tube. So it's a specific type of light that is within, that is being shown within this actual system. So when we look at this, we see the canopy, at the top, we see the perch at the bottom, we see the food reservoir in between, and presumably, it's not exactly clear on here, but either I would assume that the solar panels are on the top side of the canopy, or you can see there's another little something, almost a second canopy above that. And that might be also our solar energy system. And somewhere within that whole assembly, are probably some batteries or some rechargeable source. And I would presume that there would be a light source either at the very top or the entire assembly, or perhaps under the perch or something like that. So in short, this is the patented invention that we're dealing with. Let's take a look at a potentially infringing product. So you have here, this is in fact off of Amazon. For purposes of our discussion, we are assuming that this was released after the priority date of the patented invention. So with that in place, I just want to emphasize that because that's a big assumption that we need to make whenever you respond to anything that I present to you. You need to first verify if this product is being released after the priority date. And if I do not indicate, then I expect you to still indicate that there is assumption being made that the product was released after the priority date of the patented invention. So this is the potentially infringing product, and you can see that we have here a lighthouse that is a birdhouse that is also a solar lighthouse. We have, and let's go through just at a very high level some of the things that we're looking at in the patent. First off, is it a bird feeder? Yes, very clearly bird feeder. Second off, is there a canopy? Yeah, it looks like there's at least, it's not as big of a canopy as what we were looking at before right here, but there is some canopy underneath the solar house assembly thing. Is there a perch? Yeah, there's actually two perches. There's a perch midway down, and then there's a perch at the very bottom. Okay, is there a rechargeable power source? Now, if there's a solar lighthouse, we'll look into some more details right now, but we may need to make the assumption that if there's solar power going in, that there is some source that is that is going to a rechargeable power source. Secondly, is there a light? Now, I don't necessarily see a light. You would assume that there would be some light on here, but again, we do not know that yet. And lastly, a cathode ray light tube. We don't necessarily know if that is occurring. Let's look at some of the product description here. It's styled like a traditional lighthouse with just a pop of red. There's a feeding tray at bottom, so that could be qualified for one of the perches. There's also a perching ring, so again, perch is satisfied. The feeder captures sun's energy through a solar cell in the top. Okay, so there is a solar cell on the top. That would be some solar source that, again, we are making the assumption that it is powering some rechargeable source in some manner. It says that it powers an LED. Now, that in your mind may be an immediate flag, because the claim requires that wherein at least one light element is a cold cathode ray tube. Now, you may not be aware, but at a minimum, you could at least conclude that a cold cathode ray tube is not necessarily the same word as an LED, a light emitting diode light source. So, cold cathode ray tube is not the same as an LED light. So you may say, all right, there is not infringement because at least one limitation, namely the last limitation, is not met. But let's go through the other. There is at least a light source, so that part would be satisfied. The description relating to clarification of what the light source actually is, namely a cold cathode ray tube, would not be satisfied, but everything else would be. When we look at everything else over here, the only assumption that we're making is that there is a rechargeable power source. Now, I think that would be a very reasonable assumption. We don't see anything about batteries here. We don't see anything about some capacitor that would be storing it. But in order to receive power from solar power, and presumably the light would not be powered on during the day, Therefore, there must be some rechargeable power source that will allow the light to function at a nighttime. And in fact, it even says it illuminates with a nice glow at night. So in order for it to function at night, meaning there would not be light that would be collected by the solar panels, it must be stored in some manner. So that would be the only assumption that's being made beyond the fact that this would presumably this was released presumably after the priority date of the patented inventions. So, but with respect to the limitations, the only assumption we're making is the rechargeable light source. Everything else, for the most part, we can meet based off of the claim that we have here, with one exception, and that is the last word in clause, where at least one lighting element is a cold cathode ray tube, and we cannot show that. Therefore, the conclusion here is there is not infringement. Now, if you were the attorney here and evaluating this as a potential lead to be asserted against, the conclusion back to them would be, one, we were making the assumption that obviously it was released after the priority date. Two, we're making the assumption that that the rechargeable power source is met, and you would give your arguments as to why that is a reasonable assumption. Three, you could go through each of the other elements. At least one canopy portion is satisfied because there is at least one canopy portion shown here, and you could in fact take this image and show the canopy portion. You could show the perching ring, and you could also include the paragraph here that shows the support for the perch ring. And so you go through each of these limitations and show how it is in particular mapped to both, if possible, the image that is shown and the text. And where possible, if there's support in both of those, you include both support. Last but not least, you would say, unfortunately, the last limitation cannot be met because the claim requires a cold cathode ray tube. However, the product specifically uses an LED light source. An LED light source is not a cathode ray tube, therefore direct infringement would not occur. And then you can take a step back and you can say, as far as recommendations, if there was a pending continuation for this patent, my recommendation would be to potentially look at broadening the exact type of light that is required that it is actually being powered. In other words, if you could broaden that, in essence, where if you took out that last where-in clause, then you would have direct infringement. And that would be the goal if you're trying to assert and monetize the patent. There's some questions I have here. Does the potentially infringing product post-date the product? We discussed that. Is each element of the claim contained in the potentially infringing product? Now, we did our dissection and we went through each claim limitation and showed how it is that it can relate to the product. How much money is being generated off of the potentially infringing product? This would get to the valuation type question. We could look potentially at the patent itself. Now, if we don't have a lot of details relating to the patent, we may have to simply say, make some assumptions that there are no glaring issues within the intrinsic value of the patent. Therefore, you're basing your determination off of the demand within the marketplace. And for this particular product, let's assume that there is some such demand. At a minimum, the patent may be valued based off of the damages associated with this particular product. Do you recommend to proceed forward with a Rule 11 chart? Now, we've kind of done the breakdown already, but the recommendation would be no, because the last limitation cannot be satisfied. And because of that, you would have an incomplete Rule 11 chart. So your recommendation would be, in fact, to go back and to look at a pending counterpart and to take that pending counterpart and potentially go through strategic prosecution such that if that where-in clause could be removed, again, assuming that we could get it around the prior art, that it can be removed, which would allow a more complete Rule 11 chart to be created.